Hello and welcome to this webinar on the new town centre use classes. What are the implications? My name is Richard Garlick, editor of Planning Magazine, and your host today in partnership with Planning and Multidisciplinary Services Consultancy, Stantec. With so much controversy over the huge changes to the planning system that the government is proposing to make over the next couple of years with its white paper, the radicalism of some of the alterations it has already made has been obscured. And nowhere is this more true than with Class E, the new town centre use class introduced in September. By rolling offices, shops, professional services, light industrial and many other uses into a single class, it largely removes council control over changes between them. With the change only having been in place for 5 months and the coronavirus making property owners cautious about decision making, its impact has not so far been widely felt. But it seems obvious that this is a hugely significant change with big implications for property owners, developers, local authorities and town centres as a whole. The implications could of course get even bigger if the government follows through on its proposal to allow Class E uses to convert to residential without submission of a planning application. There may be an opportunity to explore that in the question and answer session that will follow our speakers' presentations. But initially, we're going to focus on the impact of the change that has already been implemented with the creation of the single use class for offices, shops, professional services and other town centre uses. And for this, I'm joined by 4 expert speakers who will be discussing this in depth. First, to explain how the new rights change how the new use class changes the rules, we have Nicole Kingsley, partner at Pinsent Masons, one of the highest rated planning law firms in our annual survey. How are you, Nicole, and where are you speaking to us from today?
Morning, Richard, and thank you. I'm at home, I suspect, with a lot of many people out in Essex.
Fantastic. After Nicole, to explain how to optimise the chances of success when making an application for a Class E use, as well as some of the implications for local authorities, we have Stantec's Director of Planning and Growth, Bernard Greep. Bernard has led many housing and mixed-use schemes across the north of England and beyond, consulting on many schemes, including the first phase of the Halsnede West Garden Village in Knowsley and Thorpe Park in Leeds. Bernard, how are you, and are you speaking from the north today?
Hi Richard, yeah, I'm fine, thanks. And I am speaking from the north, from the equally salubrious confines of my makeshift office.
Fantastic. One of the upsides of moving from live seminars to webinars is you tend to get a broader range of regional perspectives than you would do otherwise, and that makes up for the lack of coffee and croissants, I hope. To explain the implications that all this might have for local authority plan making, we have Daryl Phillips, Chief Executive at Hart District Council and Lead Chief Executive for the District Councils Network on Planning Matters. Daryl, are you well? Where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from the northern parts of Hampshire, just outside by it's Hart District is my local authority area, although I just live right on the edge of my district.
Very wise. I think a lot of planning officers, and I don't know about other officers and local authorities think it's best to live just outside the or not actually in the borough. So hopefully they don't get, I suppose it saves them from spending a lot of time talking about the job in the evenings. Finally, sorry, Darren.
So I was just going to say it's a very good idea not to live in your district because it helps when you go out for dinner or somewhere you don't get bombarded by questions of issues.
Yeah, I'm sure. Finally, to provide some insight into how the market is likely to respond to all this, we have OJ McDonald, Chief Executive of the Association of Town and City Management, which represents public, private and third sector town and city managers. How are you, OJ, and where are you speaking from?
Morning, Richard. A little bit tired, if I'm honest. There's a certain deadline for a big planning consultation for today, which me and the team have been working, doing some late hours on, which I'm sure a lot of you will know well. I'm actually speaking to you from my hometown of Poynton, which for a lot of planners is famous for its shared scheme, shared space scheme.
Thank you very much, OJ. And I should add that I'm speaking from home in Reigate in Surrey. Yeah, we've got a bit of certainly got a range of sectoral perspectives and a bit of a regional variety as well. So thank you all very much for sharing your expertise with us today. Each of our speakers is going to make a short presentation, and after that there's going to be some time to answer your questions. If there's something you'd like one of our speakers to consider, there is still time. Send your questions to the box below the video screen. And do remember that this webinar will be available on demand 24 hours after it finishes, so you can catch up if you've been disturbed or share it with colleagues. I'm going to ask each of our members of our panel to be reasonably concise, speak to 7 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions later. So without further delay, it's over to Nicole, who's going to kick things off by giving us an overview of how exactly the use classes have changed. Nicole.
Very much, Richard, and good morning, everybody. I suspect a lot of people have heard an overview of, heard quite a lot about the use classes order changes. So I am going to keep it brief and quite high level. But as we say, do ask us questions as we go. So as a summary, changes to the use classes order. So think back to last year, and these changes came about and into effect on the 1st of September 2020. Now, there was a challenge which creates some uncertainty after the 1st of September until the judge dismissed the challenge from Rights Community Action Group. So we do now still have the changes in effect. And as Richard mentioned, it's quite a radical change actually in terms of what was proposed and what is now in use for the use classes orders. We have principally 3 new use classes, and they encompass Class E, which is headed as a commercial business and services use. Class F1 is the learning and the non-residential uses. And Class F2 is the local community uses. Now, there are some other changes that resulted from the regulations that came into effect. And I'll come on to in a little bit that there are still permitted development rights which remain in effect to enable changes between uses until the 31st of July 2021. So what do the new use classes look like? Now, hopefully you can see a table on your screens which highlight quite a wide variety of uses. Now, as you can see, the new use class E covers anything from shops, which was A1, across to assembly and leisure, which was D2. So the regulations revoked classes A and D in their entirety. And so you have quite a wide range of Class C uses. Now, the major principal effect of this, and as was the case before the regulations, is that within a use, you do not need planning permission to change between effectively the sub-uses within that use class. So that enables, and as Richard said, enables people to change between quite very different uses without the need for any planning permission. And that, of course, takes away some of the control of the local authorities. But I'll come on to in a minute some of the practical implications, etc. So Class E, and you've heard actually about town centre uses, and indeed these were brought in to help struggling town centres, not just as a result of the pandemic actually. This is a retail change to our retail habits that was coming along anyway, and the pandemic has accelerated it. So it was brought in to provide greater flexibility and enable business to respond rapidly to changing markets. However, it is worth mentioning And although the uses in Class E are generally found on the high street, this is not limited just to high streets. These are uses across the board, so it doesn't matter on their location. So as I said, you've got the commercial, business and services use, and I've listed there those that come within that use class now. Then moving on, as I mentioned, you have the F1 use, which includes things like places of worships, public exhibition halls. Then you've got the community uses, F2. Those are small shops, so they come out of A1 and go into F2. Community halls, skating rinks. And then you have what are put into sui generis uses. So actually, if I just go back, you can see at the bottom of that table there, you've got pubs, wine bars, hot food takeaways, concert halls, bingo halls, live music venues. They all go into sui generis use. And going back to what I said just now, sui generis use you're not able to change without getting planning permission. There is some controversy as between gastropubs, for example, and restaurants, etc., and which uses they fall into, but no doubt. So practical points to note. The regulations and the amendments, they don't override the existing conditions and Section 106 obligations. But it is worth pointing out the local planning authority do have to have regard to these new regulations when people are applying to remove or modify those conditions, and indeed in terms of inserting those conditions or Section 106 obligations in the first place. Another practical point to note, Class E uses can be concurrent and they can occur at different uses, different times of the day. But if you have more than one use within different use classes, that overall use is mixed use, so you would need permission to change. The exception to that is, of course, if you have an overall primary use with then ancillary uses, and then you can then take the primary use as your main use class. Other points to note, and these have been in a number of articles and highlighted, it seems a bit of an anomaly really, and it's not very helpful. If you applied for planning permission for a use under the old use classes, you have to actually implement your old use before you can benefit from the change to the Class E. Now, we have in some cases been early enough in our planning applications to amend so that you then apply for the new use class. But where you have previously applied for the old use class, it is right that you do have to implement that old use before you can flip. Otherwise, if you're in the old use class and you're obviously already using it for that purpose, then it automatically carries across to the new use class E. So pending future applications, the first bullet point I've already covered. The description of development, and we have seen this, local authorities, and in part it's because of the final bullet point there on EIA development and actually what you assess as your impact for your development. Local authorities may well try and limit what use class within Class E you can continue to use premises for. And when you're looking at your application, you have to make sure that you do look at all of the impacts. So, for example, where you've got quite a wide Class E potential flipping between various different uses, I think the general consensus is that you take the worst case scenario, the one that has the most significant impact. But actually, a lot of local authorities are also asking people to look at the various impacts and what the differences are between them. Other points to note, lease provisions. So we're talking about planning here today, but don't forget that there are property restrictions and rights for tenants in their leases. So you may well have a permitted use which is more restrictive than your use class E now is. So that requires a discussion with your landlord, and indeed for landlords a discussion with their tenants as to where you go and whether or not you amend that to make it more flexible to accord with the amended regulations. And then finally onto local plans. Local planning authorities do have to take into consideration these new use classes. And so they need to address that as part of plans coming forward and potential changes to policy. So final point, essential for tenants and landlords to check lease provisions. Watch out for when your EIA constraints. You need to assess what is your worst case scenario, and indeed more than that, what your impacts are going to be of your intended use. Check your description of development and any potential imposing conditions. Some applicants are actually asking local authorities to narrow down their use because it means it's easier to determine the application. And then, as Richard said, finally, we've got further consultation out, which closes today, as was already mentioned, and we'll come on to that. That's the further change Class E potential to residential. And in that consultation, there was also other changes, including consolidated amendments to permitted development rights. So thank you very much. I will now pass on to Bernard.
And give some good pointers as well on some of the sort of practical implementations. And I think this is something that Bernard Greep, Director of Planning and Growth at Stantec, is going to pick up on. Bernard's going to talk to us about how to optimise chances of success when making an application for Class E use, and also look at some other implications for local authorities. Bernard.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so I'm going to try and cover what you've said there, Richard. I think what I'll say by way of introduction is the premise of the question might seem a little odd. I'll explain what I mean by that, because I'm asked to advise on how we should optimise the chances of success when making a Class E use. But of course, the whole purpose of Class E is to improve flexibility and interchangeability between those uses which are permitted within use Class E. So in most cases, not all, but in most cases, there won't actually be a need for an application. So that's the first thing I would say. And then I suppose the second thing I would say is these new changes were brought in at a time of national restriction, which was closely followed by a lockdown and then another lockdown. So there's not actually a huge amount of practical examples to draw upon. So I'm going to give my thoughts really and try and speculate on how these changes might actually manifest themselves in practice. This slide, I think, has already been covered to a large extent by Nicole. And as I say, planning permission in the large majority of cases probably won't be required, but in some cases it will. And I won't run through this in great detail because Nicole just covered lots of it, but there will be some instances where existing conditions are in place. So it's not just a carte blanche opportunity for developers to ride roughshod over existing permissions and conditions. There's a need for applicants to consider carefully any existing restrictive conditions that may be in place. And then there are things like Article 4 directions, which also will still need to be considered. And as Nicole explained, and to me this sounds a little odd, and as Nicole explained, there's an anomaly really, because the whole purpose of use Class E really is to improve flexibility and bring back into use buildings and sites that are currently not in use. But there could be situations where there's a need actually to bring into use a site, which might seem a little odd, and we can cover that in the questions a bit later on actually. There's some practical implications, and these are just my thoughts really, and I'm going to touch on things that I think Darryl will cover in a bit more detail. To my mind, the resale impact and the sequential tests probably, well, particularly in relation to the sequential test, didn't really have sharp teeth anyway, particularly in relation to sequential. Those teeth have been blunted significantly, I think. But I was going to touch on the next point, I think, in a bit of detail, because as Nicole said, these changes were brought in to assist struggling town centres effectively and make it easier to move from one change to another. But they're not restricted solely to town centres. So I think it's actually going to raise a whole set of questions as to how local authorities can assess and, if necessary, resist applications for proposals out of centre. Really interesting topic, which we'll probably talk about a bit later on. So I think to counter that risk, rather than local authorities trying to get on the back foot and think about how restrictions could be put in place, it'd be much better if local authorities were able to be proactive and embrace these changes and think about how actually these changes could assist them. And I think in order to do that, the PPG desperately needs to be updated with some practical guidance for local authorities. And I suppose ahead of that guidance, applicants should focus on the benefits that any particular scheme will bring for defined centres. And that particularly applies, I think, to applicants in relation to outer centre sites, because in the vast majority of cases, proposals for use class E schemes are likely to be non-controversial if they're in town centre locations. That probably isn't always the case if those schemes are located out of centre. A few more practical implications this time for local authorities. I mean, I think the days of retail and leisure studies are gone effectively, because I just can't see a situation where somebody could come along and identify an amount of retail that's needed, given the interchangeability between use in Class E. I think moving forward, there's going to be a need for probably something like Class E studies that embrace all of the different uses within Class E. So that is an interesting topic that we can discuss. And then I think what I'd like to see moving forward is local authorities, as I say, trying to embrace the changes and think about how they can actually use these use class changes to their benefit in terms of repurposing town centres. I think post-pandemic, there's obviously going to be a need to repurpose centres. There's probably going to be something like 20 or 30% of former retail floor space that needs to be converted or changed over to other uses. So that actually really should be an opportunity that should be grasped by local authorities through things like visions and master plans and so on. And then just finally, really, some of this might sound a little obvious, and I think it is really. I think if an applicant proposes a particular scheme in a town centre, that's likely to be uncontroversial, and as I say, in most cases, a planning application probably isn't even needed at all. But that's not always going to be the case. So it's critical for an applicant to undertake a thorough planning history review to understand any restrictions that need to be addressed. Obviously, any scheme should be policy compliant. But for those applications which are especially out of centre, I think there's a need to emphasise the benefits to assist local authorities, particularly where they're struggling to assess multi-use proposals. So that's things like football expenditure, benefits of the town centre, and so on. And I think the next bullet, the fourth bullet there, is the critical one, isn't it? How is a local authority able to assess a proposal which is labelled a use class E application only? So it's not specific to a particular use class, it's just class E. How can a local authority assess those applications? And in those cases, I think it's incumbent on the applicant to express the benefits as specifically as possible to assist the local authority. And obviously, applicants should ensure validation requirements are met to avoid any delays and seek to show how a development meets a local need. And I think to bring all that to life, I would always use infographics. And there's an example on the screen there, which I think really just shows the benefits for a local authority, such as expenditure, football, amount of floor space brought back into use, etc. Appreciate I've whistled through quite a lot there. That's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Darryl. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much indeed, Bernard. Very interesting. And now passing over to Darryl Phillips, Chief Executive at Hart District Council. And Darryl is going to sort of look in a bit more depth at some of the implications of the new use classes for plan making. Darryl.
Thank you, Richard. The new use classes on their own right will introduce a massive amount of flexibility. And of course, you need to look them in the eye of whether or not they are opportunities or threats to the high street. So we need to go through and have a look at what it is that we're trying to do when we start preparing local authorities, preparing new local plans and strategies. And it's a challenge for all local authorities because they've got current policies and new policies to draft up. And what we're going to have to look at very closely is what thought are we going to give to retail and leisure uses when these new policies are being drawn up. The point that just been made earlier by Bernard is very true, is that COVID-19 may well have had an impact on high streets immediately, But what it has actually done is to actually highlight the fact that high streets were already changing, and what this does is significantly speed up that change that we now need to reflect and pick up from Class E. And I think one of the suggestions really is, the main point being, is we ought to embrace Class E in its own right, because it's trying to free up the high street for the future, and that we shouldn't go back to the old world of looking back at what high streets were 5-6 years ago, or even beyond that. The world is changing in any event. And the other part will be very interesting, is that the introduction of Class E and perhaps the new proposals in the current consultation. There'll be a real litmus test for whether government recognises the full extent of the shake-up caused by the reform of the used classes order, and what impact they will have overall on high streets. My personal view is the impact will be positive, but it's got to be managed very, very carefully. The flexibility allowed by Class E, probably in real terms, from a planning policy point of view, drives the coach and horses through the approach we've always had. I think that's fairly obvious. The current version of the MPPF sets out the sequential test. It's already been mentioned. Of course, we have to think more carefully, because Class E, as Bernard's rightly said, extends outside the town centres. It goes into all out-of-town centres, and it starts looking at, how do you now have a sequential test? It used to be the town centre first approach, and that's now being quite put under pressure of whether that's right in its own way, given that we have a lot of retail and leisure uses outside of town centres and outside of parks. These will have effect on town centres. So when councils start developing policy, they have to think not just about the town centre, but they have to think about where the extent of the changes will take place around their area. The current policy has not been updated. The PPG is still too late. It hasn't yet picked up Class E. Other than recording that Class E is happening, it hasn't actually gone back to give any guidance and advice on what you should be doing with town centres. So the national policy in the PPG is still talking about defining the extent of the primary shopping area, and saying that where appropriate may wish to define primary and secondary retail frontages, where these uses can be justified in supporting vitality and viability of particular centres. I'm not quite sure that national policy really reflects the implications of Class E, and I'm not quite sure how this sort of advice will actually help a local authority develop planning policies when Class E sort of literally steps around it once they're built. Clearly, new applications will need to be assessed, but I think it's much more weaker in policy development terms to follow that traditional line of hierarchies and town centres and retail frontages. So current plans. Well, many current plans will now come under pressure because of because of Class E. As we know, if your current local plan policy is referred to the defunct classes, then they'll need to be amended in light of Class 3. And the problem being for most local authorities in that respect is that if you have protectionist policies about, let's say, about what was traditionally A1 uses, then how would you reflect that policy? You can't just literally just swap the words around. You actually have to start rewriting the whole context and purpose of that policy, which means a whole avenue of review work. Clearly, review would need to come into place on your local plans anyhow, but that current policies would need to go back quite early on to work out, are they still applicable in any form of sense? And certainly, if you've got policies there that have been designed to protect specific uses like A1, they need to be rethink and rewritten more broadly to looking at the implications of Class E and what Class E brings with it, which sometimes is very, very positive. It's unlikely, as Bernard points out, that you can defend policies that aim to protect retail cores. That position is much, much more weakened. And the whole point of Class E was to give you the flexibility to reflect the challenges of the future, not defend the past. And nobody, absolutely nobody, want our town centres to have empty shops or empty former shops and empty premises when we actually have to encourage new uses back in, particularly with the pressures of online shopping, etc., which are changing why people go to the town centre in the very first place. So the biggest fear for all of us, really, in one sort of sense, is Class E will undermine the town centre first policies. That's the one that's going to be the real big issue. And how do we look about stopping that and make town centres, revitalise and regenerate them into something as places that you should be looking at, rather than just areas defined on a plan. So for merging local plans, the key way forward is now to rethink, in the light of the new cold world, what it is that you want to do with a town centre. It should be done through a plan process, quite rightly so. It needs to be planned, bearing in mind that some of the position has been weakened or changed. It doesn't mean to say the planning process has stopped. The planning can still influence the place that we live in. And I think we need to think about plans aren't just about policies. They're about policies that make places, and places make policies associated with. So we need to keep thinking of things in what are we trying to achieve and make things better. I think in the days where local authorities went through the traditional policy approach of knocking up a town centre or retail or employment land studies, and then having hierarchies and boundaries and secondary areas, which are all quite simple two-dimensional documents, are probably gone. I think in the future, you've got to go back to town centres actually need proper big strategies. Retail employment land studies may well not have the same weight if they're split out in the old traditional form. Hierarchies, I think, are important in their own way. Defining boundaries on a map is going to be almost impossible nowadays, and I don't think it adds anything. We've got to go back and look at place, because the boundaries will now merge with the edges of towns as well. And defining property and secondary shopping areas when you haven't got control of Class E in the same way, I think is probably going to be much more of a weaker position to take with the council when you're actually trying to develop policy. So the effective way forward in new plans is for local authorities still to keep that leadership role and get other stakeholders involved in joining in to bring forward what should be much more visions and strategies for town centres. So that brings the wider benefit. And also we should be looking at non-planning interventions where we go and support towns, particularly with the side effect of COVID. Thank you.
Many thanks, Daryl. That's fantastic. Clearly, there's a really big job here for planning authorities in terms of thinking through the local plan work that needs to be done to take account of all this. And it does, as you say, raise questions about what levers remain for to drive a town centre first policy. Right, last but not least, we have OJ McDonald, Chief Executive Officer at the Association of Town and City Management, and OJ is going to give us a bit of a feel for what his public and private sector members, how they're reacting to all of this. OJ.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Richard. I do feel like a bit of an interloper here. I'm not a planner by trade. What I know about planning, you can probably fit on a postage stamp. And I've got some great speakers I have to follow, so this is a tall order. So what I'm here to do is I'm not going to talk about the good or bad of the new use Class E grouping, but what I will do is I will try and give you a flavour of what commercial property owners are facing at the moment, the world they live in, and how their decisions are being heavily influenced by what we're seeing in the market. And I'm going to start, as some people who have seen my presentations will know, with a case study from my childhood. And just to let you know, I'm not that old, so my childhood wasn't that long ago. This year I'm going to hit the big 40, so I'm on the very upper edge of millennials, I tell myself. So back in my day, HMV was the music retailer to be in, to shop in, and I was there constantly. It's where I spent most of my money. And what I've seen over my lifetime is this gradual shift. No, I'm going to take that back. It's not gradual. It's been almost overnight. This complete change in the market where a business like HMV is barely viable as a music retailer anymore, and that's because of how quickly technology has changed. In 2003, we had the launch of iTunes. In just 2003, not that long ago, and it transformed the music industry in terms of retail. In less than a year, it hit global sales, a peak of $3.9 billion, which is massive in terms of downloads. And remember, this is based on downloading MP3s. Now, the scary bit when it comes to change is that in less than 10 years on from that, what we saw is the retirement of the iTunes brand temporarily. And that's simply because people weren't downloading MP3s anymore. We'd moved to streaming services. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the end of a particular industry, and then the innovation coming in also being made obsolete, within the space of less than 2 decades. It's rapid, and this is what we're seeing in many sectors, which impacts our high streets, which impacts the use of commercial property. And this is the challenge for our commercial property sector. The speed of change we're seeing at the moment because of innovation is absolutely unprecedented in human history. And I have no doubt that we'll come on to COVID, but COVID is only accelerating that fact. This is a graph I was shown by one of our members down south, this rate of technological innovation, which is absolutely going through the roof. So if you have a commercial asset, how do you use that to your best advantage? How do you keep pace with some of the changes that's happening out there? So with the pressure that's happening, the pressure that's being placed on our commercial property sector, they are having to work really hard to innovate, to understand how they can keep their properties relevant. And we've seen how this is playing out in terms of the way different uses are being merged, they're being blended. And there's a real fluidity in the way we use commercial property now to keep them relevant. Let me show you some examples. This is what a modern day bank looks like. This is B-Works in Manchester by Yorkshire Bank. Very different. I've seen banks which are, honestly, you walk in, you probably wouldn't be able to tell whether it's a bank or whether it's high-end retail. This is what office space looks like for Google. So this is their Soho offices, and if you've been lucky enough to go into their King's Cross offices, which I have, I think they've got almost an entire floor dedicated to the production of fresh food, and another floor dedicated to fitness and well-being. This is what a modern day cinema will look like. Probably gaming centers during the day, showing traditional films during the evening and nighttime. The uses are so fluid at the moment, and this is what modern day bars look like. And these bleeding of uses, the use of social experiences, is not necessarily anything new, but it is on a scale we've not seen before. So the Boom Battle Bars, for example, which I'm showing here, this is really just an amped up version of a pub with a darts board and a pool table. But this fluidity between uses is something I'm seeing much more regularly. And to be honest, you know, in normal times, my office space now looks suspiciously like a Costa coffee. And I'm sure that's the same for a lot of people. And then there's another angle to this, and that is the financial pressure now on commercial landlords placed by the pandemic. There's now real concerns that some of the UK's banks are getting a bit nervous about their exposure to the debts being mounted by the UK commercial property sector, and that they may start to call in some of those debts in the middle of this year. So that means there is a real need for them to adapt, to innovate, to make sure they can keep income coming in. So just as a final note, what I'd say is, through our experiences, some of the best routes round this challenging situation we find ourselves in, and those challenges will be as equally difficult for the planning industry as it will be for the commercial landlord sector, as it will be for the occupiers on the high street, is it will have to be about partnership, it will have to be about dialogue. There is, I feel, with the world moving so quickly, there's probably only so much we can do through proper, organised, long-term placemaking at the moment. So much of this is going to have to be about people sitting around a table, developing a shared vision, so we can allow the market to get on and do what it needs to do. And I am playing devil's advocate, believe me, there are some bits of the deregulation we're seeing which make me uncomfortable. But I do think this partnership, this dialogue, and this ability to flex is going to be critical for the future going forward. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, OJ. That's really, really interesting to sort of give us a bit of a vision of what this might actually look like, you know, when this all takes effect. And I think very interesting also to hear from a few contributors that you know, these changes. You know, it's interesting that not. You know, we've seen a lot of negative reaction to this change. It's interesting to see that that's not the universal view. Now we've got some interesting questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to start by firing out a few of those. We've got a mix of sort of very technical questions, which I'll probably sort of push towards Bernard and Nicole, and maybe some broader questions, which I will push towards the others. Can I ask you to give concise answers, please, because we've got lots of ground to interesting ground to cover. So first of all, a question from Keith Zammit, who's a planning officer at Castle Point Borough Council, and I put this to maybe I don't know if Bernard would like to take this one. Is it worth local planning authorities seeking to restrict changes of use within Class E in the interest of preserving the vitality of centres?
Right. Well, okay, I'll take that one. I can understand exactly why local authorities are asking that question, because I think in the first quarter of last year, there was something like 5,000 comparison retail units lost across the country. That was the first quarter of last year alone. That number is probably going to rocket up for the rest of last year and into this year. And pre-pandemic, centres had too much floor space anyway. So I can completely understand why local authorities are nervous about these changes. In terms of trying to restrict uses within centres, I don't think that's the issue myself personally, because most of these Class E uses, if not all of them, are acceptable in town centres anyway. I think the issue really is the threat to town centres from outer centre schemes. Given the difficulty of assessing proposals for a purely Class E scheme, if you follow, trying to restrict uses in centres is against the grain of what is sought, I think. Having said that, there will be instances where it is appropriate to restrict, but I think as a generality, that should be the exception rather than the rule.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bernard. The second question is from John Halton, a Principal Planning Officer at Pendle Council. And maybe, I don't know, Nicole, if you'd like to take this one. He says, intended to protect the high street, does the broad nature of Class E and the new permitted changes open up the possibilities of local authorities being unable to control proposals for change of use that could result in edge of centre or out of centre retail? I think that's something we've already touched on, but I guess, is this leaving, maybe to sort of augment John's question, are there really any planning levers left for local authorities who do want to restrict out of town and thereby boost town centre retail?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And maybe actually I'll pass this across to Darryl in a minute. Certainly from a sort of a legal standpoint, I mean, clearly the local authority has to determine planning applications where you are applying for planning permission. And of course, that's one of the issues here. But where you are applying for planning permission, you have to determine it in accordance with the local plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. So where there is a planning application, of course, the local authority can balance the various sort of benefits and adverse impacts to get to their determination. And use of car, transport, unsustainable development, etc., would be one of those that they weigh in the balance. But where you're not applying for planning permission, unless you have an existing Section 106 or condition attached to your planning permission, which governs the existing uses, there will be no ability for the local authority to restrict changes within Class E, because that's the very nature of it, is that you don't need planning permission. Now, of course, the challenge I think comes, and Bernard's covered this as well as Darryl, for the out of town, where applicants then apply to the local authority to vary or amend those existing conditions. And actually in those cases, and there's quite a recent case showing the sort of the direction really of the courts, which is that you will have to take in, or one of the factors taken into account is the amendment regulations. So it is a very difficult task, I think, for local authorities. But let me pass over to Darryl, because actually he's probably better placed to respond on behalf of sort of local authority side.
Okay, so Darryl, is there a does this really leave local authorities who are who want to actively who want to sort of restrict out of town development in order to boost town centre development, does this remove the planning levers that they have?
Not totally, no. I think we have to, as Nicole's just made the real point on there, some of the damage has already been done from a local authority point of view, is because these are now already, the uses are already in place in terms of premises have already got planning permission, already been granted permission, they're built. They can then move using the new rights without any further permissions. That's there now. So we're not really talking about those ones because they're not in our control, they've got. But in terms of, if you have a proper local plan in place that has very clear objectives, very clear policies about what it's trying to achieve, and bears in mind the rights that are given by the new class, then if you've got that policy in place, you can still determine a planning application on its merits, taking that as a material consideration into account. And therefore, if you have that, certainly if it's been tested through a local plan examination, at that point, you'll have some strength in your arm. But what you can't try and do is to ignore Class C and put in policies that try to block Class C. You've got to work with Class C and bring it forward and manage it in its right way. Class C may not be applicable, and may not be appropriate in every instance, but you have an evidence base to support why that. You can't just do a gut reaction and try and find a way to stop it. That's otherwise it defeats the object of why the government brought it in the first place. But I think there's still a role for local plans to have proper policies for new development, looking at the town centre first. But what you can't do is stop the damage that's already happened.
Thank you, Daryl. Right, next question I think is kind of obviously one to sort of direct at OJ. It's a question from David Kaner, a member of the Covent Garden Community Association, and he asks, do we think offices will go the same way as records and CDs? So one for you, OJ.
That's a really good question. So I think just a few days ago, Aviva have confirmed that working from home for them now is going to be standard practice. What they do say though, and I think this will probably be the norm, is that a lot of large employers, they might not necessarily rely on office space like they used to. Thanks to COVID, everybody's found new ways of working, but they will still need some level of office space, because I think for people working from home permanently is probably not necessarily something that's going to happen. So Aviva have said they will retain some of their office space, but let some of it go. And I can imagine a lot of large employers doing the same. And we've been having discussions about this hybrid model we might work towards, whereby some people might work some of their time from home or from their employer's office, or might even find a different type of office space, like working from a cafe or a hotel or any other business that's now a bank, any other business that's now offering office space. And also I think this particular thing, actually, the Aviva example just links into the previous question about out of town and what the impact on out of town might be. So there is also the dynamic that for large parts of the market, I think where we're seeing probably less reliance on commercial space because of the way digital's changed the game, some of the commercial space we might still rely on, they will probably prefer to be in town and city centres. So looking at the Aviva press release, the office stock they're looking to get rid of tends to be those in business parks, while their city centre sites are the ones they are prioritising to hold onto. So we need to remember that as well. I think for the market, if they're only looking at using so much space, I think the out of town stuff, which is more disconnected, is likely to be the first things to go.
Fantastic. Thank you, AJ. Okay, now another interesting question here, which opens up the whole question of the government's proposal to, on top of the changes we've been discussing, to also make it possible for Class E property to convert to residential without a planning application, and the consultation on that closed today. So in light of that, Richard Wakeford, town councillor from Gloucestershire Market Towns Forum, asks, can small market towns survive given the much higher value of residential? Who would like to answer that? OJ, I'll come to you first. I can't see so OJ, if you could ask you to give a concise answer, and if anybody else would like to chip in, I would give me a signal.
Yeah, sure. So I absolutely understand the changes in terms of use Class E and bringing various groups together. Like I've explained from the market perspective, I'm quite horrified by this next step of then being able to convert all of that to residential. And I think there will be challenges for certain areas. And I think for me, the economic context we're looking at with the commercial property sector absorbing much of the pain that's been felt throughout the pandemic, I think there may well be some landlords, especially where there's fragmented property ownership, where you could see an excessive amount of conversions to residential, and that does concern me. So there will definitely be challenges with this.
Okay, would anybody else like to comment on that, on the implications for market towns and their survival, or indeed the implications more widely?
Yeah, I'll chip in there, Richard, if that's all right. Yeah, I mean, I echo the comments from OJ. These changes seem to be nonsensical to me, really. I mean, I can, as OJ said, I can completely understand the principle of trying to combine retail and other town centres within Class E, notwithstanding all the problems that might raise that we've just discussed. To broaden it out into T3 seems the wrong approach to me. Much better would be to do what Darryl suggested early on, which is to really encourage and persuade and tool up local authorities to grasp the nettle and realise that market towns are struggling. There is too much surplus retail floor space there. They do need to diversify. There is a need to repurpose them. But don't just open the floodgates to what could potentially be inappropriate and ad hoc development. There's a need to really grasp it through properly planned, visionary town centre planning, rather than having a loophole that, as I say, could be exploited by potentially either not necessarily unscrupulous, but inappropriate uses.
Okay, thank you very much, Bernard. Is there any other contributions on that, or shall we move on to the next question? If members of the panel, just raise a hand if you want to add anything. No. Okay. So the next question we have is from, and this is a more technical one. It's from Jagravi Upadhyaya, and he is a solicitor from Woodruff Solicitors, and he asks, with regard to a commercial lease, if a tenant wishes to change the use from old A1 to A3, now both within Class E, does this change the need for planning permission and landlord's consent for the proposed change of use? Who would like to deal with that question?
Yeah, Richard, I'm happy to answer that. Legal question. We're into sort of landlord and tenant law rather than planning law, and I guess the main point of that is they sit separately. So your lease is a contract as between the tenant and the landlord. So if your lease restricts you from using the premises to a specific A1 use, regardless of what the planning legislation is doing, you're still prevented from changing that use under the terms of your lease. So that would then require a discussion with the landlord as to whether or not you can change that permitted use under your lease, or how much flexibility you can agree with the landlord, and that will obviously be influenced by financial and commercial considerations, and potentially precedent for the landlord and which other premises they have, etc., and what the premises are and where they are. But just because planning legislation is doing something doesn't mean that it then flows automatically through into your landlord-tenant relationship. They're two separate things.
Okay, thank you very much.
Does that answer it?
I think yeah, absolutely. I think so. And is there anybody else who wants to chip in on that one? If not, we can move on to the next question. Fantastic. Okay. So our next question is from, just scrolling through the list, from Geoffrey Stack, who is the Chief Executive of Broxbourne Borough Council. And Geoffrey asks, presumably the change between, for instance, a pub and a wine bar, although sui generis, would not be a material change of use and still not need permission. Who would like to take that question?
Richard, just say again, what was the changes?
Yeah, so it's a change between, for example, a pub and a wine bar. Would that be, he's basically seeking confirmation that that change would not need a, would not be a material change of use and not need permission. And that's still asking if that's still the case.
I think, subject to checking, that they are both sui generis. So in that instance, there would be a requirement to get planning permission to change. So a sui generis use is not a use class in itself. It applies to each individual use that is giving you your sort of nationally deemed planning permission for that use. But the very nature of sui generis is that it applies to the specific use. So you can't change within sui generis, within all of the uses that are determined to be sui generis. You have to apply for planning permission to do so. I mean, I think there is a confusion, and there would be, it would be helpful if we had some direction between gastropubs, for example, as I mentioned, and how different are they to restaurants, for example. Clearly there is a bit of difference, but very different in the approach as to how they're dealt with under the amendment regulations and the use classes, restaurants being in class E and pubs being sui generis. But no, so I don't believe that you would be able to change as between those uses within the sui generis, because they're very specific to the individual use.
Okay.
Darryl was nodding his head, so
sorry, Darryl, what would you like to add something?
I think that's exactly right, is that sui generis is the use class as you describe, and therefore, like in the old provisions for sui generis uses, you need permission to move between them. All they're just to making clear is that they're not within a use class. That's the point. So they will need permission.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, let me just scan through and see if we've got any final questions that we need to ask. Some of them I think are probably a bit, there are one or two very technical questions that are probably a bit hard to address properly in this format. Just had one last one come in. Okay, a question from Chris Carr, Spatial Planning Team Leader at Gateshead Council. And Chris asks, is there a role for retail hierarchy in terms of a positive strategy while accepting less control over the retail character of centres? Who would like to address that?
Richard, I could do that.
Who is that?
It's Darryl.
Darryl, yes.
I still believe there's a plan-led system here to be had. But I think you just need to be very clear about what your objectives. I don't think you can have blanket retail policies anymore. I think you need to be looking at vision and placemaking in town centres and other areas, wherever you are, and you should still come up with your hierarchy, what you're trying to achieve, and encourage that development. I just don't think you can do it through a control mechanism. I think it's got to be a positive strategy that has bespoke policies for those areas as to what you want to achieve, and you still have control over new development. Without doubt, that's where the use class will become a material consideration, but so will your objective and your policy approach. That's how you'll control it, but don't come up with the old ways of saying a blanket policy for certain types of areas will achieve. So a hierarchy of centres is important, as long as you have a vision for what does that mean in reality. And how does that change? It can't just be the old principle of hierarchy, principle of locations.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you very much to all our participants and for a very interesting discussion. A quick reminder that the session is going to be available on demand 24 hours after this live session finishes. Thank you, Nicole, Bernard, Daryl and OJ for taking part and sharing your expertise. And thank you to everybody who took part in the Q&A session and asked such interesting questions. And thanks to everybody else for listening in. And thanks once again to our partners, Stantec. Enjoy the rest of your day.